The Women's Leadership Institute in the Auburn University College of Liberal Arts is pleased to present Leaders Educating Through Discussion. We hope you will take a moment after you watch our presentation to add your own voice to the dialogue on our website, auburn.edu/womensleadership.
My first memories of Auburn reach back to 1943 when I was 8 years old. I arrived in Auburn with my mother and aunt to see her daughter. They stayed at the Old Pitts Hotel, only place to stay. Well, there was one other little one, a little bit smaller. And I spent the night with my cousin Elizabeth Ann's in her dorm room in Alumni Hall. I have a vivid memory of sleeping uncomfortably on the top of her study desk, watching the tower of Sanford Hall through the bare tree limbs and listening to the clock chime out the hours. The night seemed endless. During high school, I often visited Auburn, and there was never a doubt where I was going to college. Auburn has been a special place to me and to my family for many years, as it has to many of you. It's been over 119 years since the first women were admitted to Auburn, and it is unsettling to me to realize that I have memories of over half of those years. I'm very pleased that in 1991, the University Women's Centennial Committee asked me to write about the admission of women. It's a wonderful story. And with my little competitive nature and being in the Auburn family for so long, I was just thrilled to be able to write about it because Auburn did this 1 year before the University of Alabama admitted women. And although I don't have this in my lecture notes, I must say that Auburn, what are you going to do with all this tape? Am I going to get my... Auburn gave women baccalaureate degrees. I mean, like, BSs and BAs and so forth. The University of Alabama did not give their women at first baccalaureate degrees. They gave them diplomas in the school that they came into. They also were not originally allowed to come in and sit in class. They had to sit outside the window. There were big windows in the classroom, so they sat outside in chairs and listened through the windows or the door outside to the professors. So it took a little bit of while to do that. I've got this script, but I keep varying from it. And I won't tell this story because it's not in here, but when I finished the story of women at Auburn, it was like we had the celebration in the fall of 1992. And when I finished, I thought, next year, the University of Alabama is going to have their centennial of women. I wonder what they're doing. So I called up and I asked my contacts in administration and faculty and various places. I said, what are you all planning? Nothing. Really? So I called Suzanne Wolf, who was the editor of Alabama Heritage, and I said, is anybody over there that you know of working on women's admission to the University of Alabama? She said, no. I said, can I do it, please? And she said yes. So I wrote for Alabama Heritage, the only thing that I know that has been done in a public forum, at least not at that time, about the admission of coeducation at both Auburn and Alabama. Okay, I must tell you that the little book that I wrote is certainly not the last word on the subject. Since the university wanted something to give away, and since I only had a few months to research and write it, there were simply limits on what we could produce. I know since 1992 that some Auburn students have written papers. I have talked to several of these students. They have called me. I've read some of their papers and discussed with them what they might do, and we've sort of brainstormed together, and I've been very supportive of what they were doing. But it's very sad to me that Auburn University not only has no published history of women at Auburn, but it has no published scholarly history of the university. Now, most universities have both scholarly histories, and they also have the very pretty glossy coffee table books on the history of the university. Now, we've got numerous histories of Auburn football, which arrived on campus the same year that co-eds enrolled. Now, I can think of only one of those books on Auburn football that noted that women arrived the same time that football did. And of course, you know, the jokes have absolutely been made about this. You know, the team needed cheerleaders. The guys would play harder if they had pretty girls watching and wearing their colors and that sort of thing. But I think it's rather interesting that the two came in 1892. I've been advocating for a history of Auburn University for 40 years, and I began advocating when I was on the faculty at Samford University. This void is especially sad because Dr. George Petrie spent 55 years educating and training young people to be historians, mostly men, I should say, all men, I guess, many of whom went on to earn PhD degrees at Eastern universities outside the South, Midwest, and so forth, and to publish many books. It's also especially sad because the Auburn History Department has been such an outstanding department through all the years, producing many graduate students and contributing much to the life of the university, the life of the town of Auburn, and they now have and have consistently had a very fine concentration in Alabama history. Although George Petrie's collection at the Auburn University Library is quite large, we know that Petrie's, quote, great trunk full of documents has been lost. These were documents that he collected to write a biography of William L. Yancey. So we can assume that he may have had many other primary source materials on the history of Auburn, and they may have been lost as well. Nonetheless, the Petrie collection contains little about the beginning of coeducation at Auburn, except for Mrs. P.H. Mell's scrapbooks. Petrie had traditional Southern male views of females, and he interacted with co-eds with gallantry and a sense of humor. But as Professor Bob Ray's study of the Auburn University History Department indicates, Dean Petrie had little use for women historians and female faculty. Every historian who researches and writes about women struggles to locate personal documents generated by women. I hope such documents for Auburn's co-ed still exist, perhaps in attics and basements, in tin bread boxes, in shoe boxes, in trunks, and safety deposit boxes. And I pray that these records will find their way to the Auburn archives at the library where scholars can use them. It is possible to write Auburn history from published records and self-studies and catalogs and newspaper accounts, plainsman stories, and glomerata articles. But history from these sources just fails to show the vitality and the spirit that I associate with Auburn, and I think all of you do too. To create the heart, the vibrancy that I know as Auburn, I needed more information. I sent letters to all living Auburn female alumni, those that the Auburn Alumni Association had valid or current addresses for, which meant that I was tapping into the memories of students who attended Auburn from the late 1930s. I asked them to write reminiscences of their college experiences, and I received several dozen responses, most of them including some kind of meaningful stories of their college days. But recollections are not as valuable to the historian as diaries and letters, which have an intimacy, a charm, detailed descriptions that are often missing from memoirs. I was able to locate a few scattered letters from Auburn male students. You know, you all don't write letters. I guess you do if you print off some of your email, but Auburn students as late as the early 60s were still writing letters home because it cost so much to call long distance. Today, of course, that is all completely changed. I never did locate a diary written by a co-ed while she was a student at Auburn. I found a few scrapbooks with dance cards and clippings and sorority memorabilia, autographed books, party invitations, but this didn't tell me how she felt about things. Many Auburn men and women called me and talked to me about their experiences at Auburn because that was easier to do than to write me about it. Some sent me photographs and some sent me memorabilia. I always hoped that my study of Auburn would inspire Auburn women to donate primary sources to the archives in the library. Especially do I wish that all of you there, all the daughters and granddaughters who will be cleaning out the clutter of my life and your lives, all of our lives, will be mindful that what seems like junk to them would be gold to a historian. The story of women at Auburn begins with the founding in 1856 of the East Alabama Male College by Macon County Methodists. Lee County was part of Macon County at that time. They also established a comparable school in Tuskegee, close enough for some faculty to occasionally teach at both institutions, but distant enough so that male and female students could not easily commingle. The Civil War sent Auburn cadets off to fight, and the East Alabama Male College closed. When it reopened after the war, hard times kept the small school in debt, its future uncertain. In 1872, when the Alabama legislature voted to locate the land-grant college at Auburn, the Methodists were happy to be relieved of the financial burden of the college and deeded the buildings gladly to the state of Alabama so that the East Alabama Male College could become, under the Federal Morrill Act, the state land-grant university. This victory was achieved after a fight with the University of Alabama, who wanted the land-grant designation too. The University of Georgia had recently acquired the land-grant status for the state of Georgia, and Tuscaloosa was interested in expanding the university. The next time you roll Toomer's Corner, look to heaven and say a little thank you prayer to Shell Toomer, who was the East Alabama legislator given credit for securing Auburn as the site of the land-grant college in 1872. Instead of Florence and Tuscaloosa, who were fighting so hard for it. His son, Shell Jr., was a halfback on Auburn's first football team, a pharmacy graduate who opened Toomer's Corner and later purchased the building for $7,000 in 1906. As the land-grant school, Auburn was renamed Agricultural and Mechanical College of Alabama and then was named the Alabama Polytechnic Institute, or API, officially by the state legislature in 1899. Regardless of all of those names, the students and townspeople and others tended to call the small college in Auburn simply Auburn. Auburn's campus was a male-only, macho world of compulsory uniforms and drills, roll calls at daylight, and stern military discipline. The town was filled with houses that boarded boys, with stores that offered men's clothing and military uniforms, and with a vibrant social scene that included secret fraternities outlawed by the college and all sorts of youthful pranks. In this masculine world, on proper occasions, Auburn men invited the presence of what was then called the fairer portion of humanity. If there was one thing that Auburn men held in common, it was that they loved the ladies and shared an idealized view of Southern womanhood. And I might mention, before I go on, because I don't have this in here, but the train is really important, because the train brought the girls in from Montgomery and brought the girls from Columbus and Atlanta, and it's a little bit harder to get to Auburn from Birmingham because the Florida short route, which it began, is now Highway 280, of course, was not in existence at that time. Today's distinction between the genuine lady and the frivolous and sometimes false and air-headed belle never crossed their minds. The Old South mystique of the Southern woman influenced Auburn male attitudes toward women, and cadets kept their belles upon a pedestal and their courting within the Victorian rules of propriety. Well, most of the time. These attitudes toward women also determined the education that females were provided by their parents, as well as the education that they were not provided by their state. In the antebellum era, women were taught at home and educated in female seminaries where distinctive Southern womanhood could be protected. Higher education, higher learning, was thought to be too taxing for a woman, and some doctors actually wrote that it could be physically harmful, perhaps resulting in brain fever. The common thought was that a college education was not necessary in order for women to develop into good wives and good mothers, and such education might make a woman less feminine. One medical doctor of the era claimed that a female needed special times to rest, especially during her monthly periods when there was, quote, an enormous increase of nerve waste and poison was retained in her system and acted upon the gray matter of the brain frontal lobes, end of quote. Thus, excessive studying would be harmful to a woman's health. But Civil War experiences changed Alabama women. They were forced to shoulder heavy responsibilities for their farms and families and businesses while their menfolk were off fighting, and some of their men never came home, forcing those widows who may have had orphan children to shoulder even more responsibilities and more burdens. After the war, there were more women in Alabama than men. The number of spinsters increased. I've got to stop here and tell a story. Larry Owsley was a wonderful historian in the history department for many, many years. And I remember one time he was lecturing and he was talking, and he said that Dean Petrie and some of the older historians that he remembered thought that maybe one of the reasons why the South went into this sort of retrenchment era in what we would call the Bourbon period of before 1900, before we had the progressive movement and the other things, that was because there were so many spinsters, that every household in the state had a spinster in the family, and that she dictated the protocol and the other kind of things. And they were very frustrated because they couldn't find men, and so therefore it was all these spinsters that were running the South. I just was very amused by that thought, but it's an interesting thought to think about. In the North before the Civil War, women had attended female colleges without harm to their health, and during the Civil War, Midwestern universities admitted women when conscription reduced the number of male students, and institutions were threatened by falling enrollments. In the North, coeducation had proved successful, and women's health had not been destroyed by competition with men. In Alabama, social reformer Julia Tutwiler led the movement to create educational opportunities for women. Her father, the founder of the very famous Green Springs School in Hale County, Greene County originally, and a former professor at the University of Alabama, had allowed young Julia to attend classes with the boys, and she later studied at Vassar College in New York and in Germany. Although there were female colleges, seminaries, and institutes in antebellum and postbellum Alabama, no school in the state provided a true university-level education or granted title degrees to women. I was very intrigued by this, and I talked to Frances Hamilton and Elizabeth Wells, who have the history of Judson College, one of the most well-known college for girls in the state, and with an antebellum tradition. And I asked her, at what time did Judson provide a university-level education on the same level as the University of Alabama or the education at Auburn? And she said not till the 1920s. So you can see there's a huge gap in the quality of education provided for girls. Okay, these colleges awarded diplomas, not baccalaureate degrees. Tutwiler believed that Alabama was too poor a state to create a 4-year graduate degree university for women, and she was convinced that the answer to the problem was coeducation. She was determined to open higher education in Alabama for women on the same terms that it was available for young men. Opponents of coeducation argued that male students would be distracted by having females in the classroom, and since women were mentally inferior, women would lower the academic standards of an institution. Women would destroy religious beliefs, promote promiscuous behavior, force a change in the honor system, and ruin of the male spirit on campus. Co-eds would encourage men to marry early before they were established in their professions, and thus this would have a pernicious effect upon the man's career. Tutwiler challenged all these arguments. She believed that the loveliest women and the noblest men grew up in families as sisters and brothers, and that segregation of the sexes dated, quote, from the days when monks and nuns were the only teachers. In the hard times of the 1880s, Alabama parents could ill afford to send their daughters north to school, where the laboratories and facilities of the women's colleges matched those of the two Alabama state universities. Although Tutwiler focused her attention on the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa, it was the Agricultural and Mechanical College at Auburn that first allowed women to matriculate. A&M College President William Leroy Brune was aware of Tutwiler's crusade in West Alabama, which was changing the climate of opinion in the state. In 1892, President Brune requested that Auburn's Board of Trustees admit women to degree programs. You know, one thing I don't have in here, but I think is very true, it's not very idealistic, but there were some practical economic things that were swirling around this little town of Auburn. You had professors with daughters, and they simply couldn't afford to send them outside. They were also worried about those northern Yankee schools and what might happen if they sent their precious daughters beyond the Mason-Dixon line to be educated. And so it seemed to them a rather practical thing to let these Auburn girls begin to come to Auburn, and that's in essence what happened. In 1892, President Brune requested that the Auburn Board of Trustees admit women to degree programs. A number of Auburn professors were already allowing townswomen to sit in on their lectures, and this had not proved distracting to cadets, so the faculty supported the president's stand. A group of determined Auburn girls, especially faculty daughters, and particularly Brune's own precocious daughter, Kate Conway Brune, were behind the faculty's resolve and Brune's support for coeducation. On June the 13th, 1892, the Auburn trustees voted to open the doors of the college to young women who were qualified to pursue the studies of the junior class. And the following fall, Kate Brune and two Auburn friends, all three 20 years of age, took and passed examinations and began classes in the general course of study. The next year, after watching the successful experiment at Auburn, the University of Alabama admitted women. In 1894, Kate Brune, Willie Little, and Kate Teague received their Auburn degrees with all honors and accepted Governor Thomas G. Jones' congratulations at the largest graduation ceremony ever held in Auburn to that time. During the early years of coeducation, women who attended Auburn were mostly town girls, or they were from Opelika or Lee County, and they lived at home or they boarded with relatives. Auburn had no special rules for co-eds since they lived at home, except that women were required to walk directly to class and following class dismissal to depart the campus immediately so cadets would not be distracted. Later, the university furnished a room on the second floor of Sanford Hall as a rest and study area for co-eds. When I was reading about this, I thought back to the fall of 1953 when I had a class on the third floor of Sanford Hall, and the closest restroom was the second floor. And I remember vividly when I went in to that ladies' room, and it was a large room, and I thought, my goodness, there was a fainting couch, an antique couch, you know, over there, and there was some chairs and all there, and I thought, well, this is interesting. And I never thought about it, but when I began to research this so many decades later, I just wondered the history of that fainting couch and whether that was really the one that they put there in 1893. Female enrollment grew slowly, reaching a high of 19 in 1898. But those females who attended Auburn won academic honors with ease, often pushing aside males for scholastic awards. In 1916, when Sarah Evelyn Moore graduated, she was the only woman in her class, and her picture's on the front of the little book. She wrote the class poem about the fair city of Auburn, with its sturdy oaks turning green in springtime, a town full of homes, churches, college boys, co-eds, professors, a center of study and learning. She noted the names of great men who spoke at the college, whose deeds were recorded on boulder and tablet. She wrote of the Southland with its great history yet to be written, and she told a tale of Auburn, one of adventure and progress. At the site of her dear Auburn College, gathered each autumn, the freshmen as green as the grasses, boys mostly, with just a few co-eds like blossoms amid the deep verdure. With a feminist strike so clean, it surely passed without any of the boys of 1916 noticing. She wrote that after 4 years, some leaves were missing, but never a one of your blossoms. For almost 30 years, Auburn provided no dormitory for women students, and co-eds who attended Auburn boarded in town as the boys did, although the homes in which girls lodged were more carefully selected, and boarding houses were never mixed by sex. There were no college rules for their behavior because they were considered grown young ladies who behaved themselves at home and elsewhere with dignity and discretion, and they needed no matron. Mary Yarber boarded 10 girls at her home, Pebble Hill, where the Caroline Marshall Drone Center for the Arts and Humanities is now. She fed them their meals, loaned them her car to drive to Opelika on Saturday afternoon to see the picture shows, and she only had 2 rules for her girls. Be a lady and have all your coat hangers hooked in the same direction. The decade of the 1920s saw significant developments for women on campus. The establishment of the School of Home Economics, they actually were teaching courses in that, but not quite the establishment at that time. And more majors for women, of course, resulted in an increase in female enrollment. The Auburn administration must have worried about all those short skirts, smoking, bathtub gin, and dancing, for the 20s had hardly begun to roar when Auburn established the first director of women students and then the office of dean of women. 2 deans play significant roles in the history of women at Auburn. Dr. Rosalie Walston provided a level of professionalism to the dean's office, and Dean Catherine Cooper Cater brought a formidable personality, plus 2 degrees and a strong work resume. Dean Cater lived on the 2nd floor of Cater Hall, where 3 decades or so later she died, named Social Center after the president moved to the president's home on Mell Street. Dean Cater served as dean from 1946 to 1976 when the position was abolished. When I came as a freshman 7 years after she did, Dean Cater was Auburn. I thought she was a motherly, stern matron and old. What a shock when I did the research in 1991 for this, when I was 56, and I realized Dean Cater was only 38 years old in 1953. We laugh today about freshman rules, being in the dorm by 7:30 p.m. on weeknights and 11 o'clock on weekends. We signed in and out of the dorm and needed written permission to go out of town, anywhere but home. We went merrily on our way across campus to PE classes on a sunny day with our raincoats flapping around our knees to hide our gym shorts, convinced, because Dean Cater assured us, we were much more ladylike because shorts should never be worn in public places other than the beach. Everyone was afraid of Dean Cater, boys as well as girls, boys especially. She once sent a bill to Coach Ralph Jordan, the head football coach here, for 2 bras and 3 pairs of underpants, which was stolen by A Club members during a panty raid. When she talked with you earnestly, she always looked directly into your eyes, and you wondered? No, you worried if she might be able to read your mind. There are hundreds of stories about Dean Cater. Atlanta best-selling author and former Auburn student Ann Rivers Siddons tells about being in Auburn after a football game 10 years after she graduated. She was eating dinner with her husband and another couple when Dean Cater walked in the restaurant. Ann immediately grabbed her drink and put it on the floor under the table. Her husband laughed and said, "Ann, you don't have to hide your drink anymore for Dean Cater." On orientation day, Dean Cater spoke to all the girls. She explained that we were now Auburn women, and that as Auburn women we behaved in certain ways, and that if we were Auburn women we would do likewise, and that we would not be able to stay in Auburn if we didn't. That's simple. Learn the rules and follow them. Living within what we call Cater's laws was not difficult for me and for my contemporaries, for the rules were similar to those of our own mothers. For most of us, that day in orientation, we made a vow not to cross Dean Cater and to do everything we could to stay out of her aim of fire. What we didn't know, and something she worked to hide from us, was that she had a heart of gold, a caring heart, and that she was willing to do whatever it took to help us be good students and to mature into responsible young women. Auburn was happy to have Dean Cater after the scandals that office had preceded her, that happened in that office before she came. Dean Rosalie Walston resigned in 1946 after a well-publicized confrontation with Auburn President Luther Duncan. At issue was the punishment of a female student disciplined by the Women's Student Government Association with support and approval from Dean Walston. President Duncan approved their recommendation and the student was expelled. The real story is not whether the student was guilty or innocent or what happened or whether a punishment was too harsh, and the mystery story is did she do it or did she not, and all of this. But the interesting story, I think, is how the male administration treated the female students and female administrators in the Dean of Women's office after the men changed their minds and agreed to leniency. It was a huge brouhaha, with every detail covered in the Montgomery, Birmingham, and Columbus, Georgia newspapers, some in the Birmingham papers, but more in Montgomery and Columbus. When the girl and her parents were backed by the Alabama Farm Bureau, the governor, prominent business leaders, and some state legislators, the all-male Auburn Board of Trustees decided the Dean of Women and the Women's Student Government Association had been too harsh. President Duncan started backing up. I recall one letter that referred to Dean Walton as an old biddy. On April the 1st, 1943, Governor Frank M. Dixon wrote President Duncan that under no circumstances, this is the governor now, listen to his words, brilliant. Under no circumstances would I try to interfere in a case of this kind, but I am inclined to go a long way, as I know you are, to save the future of a young woman in her position. Duncan, a masterful politician, understood exactly what the governor meant. The Auburn president announced that the student could enroll in the summer, where, according to her Women's Student Government Association being expelled, she had to wait a longer time before she could come back. The result was mass resignation of all dorm mothers, WSGA leaders, secretaries, the withdrawal of some female students, editorials in state newspapers, and dozens of letters to the governor and to President Duncan on both sides of the issue. When I was doing this research, I realized that Dean Walston's personal secretary, we would call him administrative assistant today, who resigned with the dean was Mary Green, who was then the widow of the dean of the Auburn College of Veterinary Medicine, who was living in Cary Woods, a lady I'd known 30 years. So I immediately called Mary and asked about the incident. My mild-mannered, usually very calm friend became angry at the men of the Auburn administration as though the events had happened last week instead of almost a half century before. World War II brought large numbers of women faculty because many of the young male professors were off at war, and because when they came home, the GI Bill paid tuition for veterans to go to college, and Auburn, like other colleges in the state and across the nation, were simply flooded with students. Many Auburn professors were married to women who held master's and sometimes doctoral degrees, and they had been at home taking care of children, and because of the rules of the university involving dual employment and no two people in a family could have tenure and that sort of thing, they simply were staying home. They represented the quickest faculty recruitment available, and these faculty wives immediately went into the classroom to help Auburn, and they stayed there for the most part. What I have written about Auburn women raises about as many questions as it answers. I'm still not sure how the early co-eds felt about crashing into a man's world. I'm confident they felt pressure to measure up, to prove they could make the good grades that many men told them they were incapable of earning. After all, they had to make those grades to stay in school. But Auburn women were probably as different in their attitudes toward their studies and their life as Auburn women are today. When I was a first quarter freshman, there were 8 boys on campus to every girl. The reputation in the state was, go to Auburn and get your MRS degree. Find a husband. That's not true today, or is it? Today, Auburn women have far more role models than I did. Female deans and professors and even a provost. Women serve on the Board of Trustees. It's such a different world. When I told my 2 grandchildren, who are now students at Auburn, I've got 13, but I just have 2 here now, that my first quarter tuition was $44, they couldn't believe it. My granddaughter lives in the very same freshman dorm I did, next door to the dorm her mother lived in, but Elizabeth Ann has air conditioning and an elevator. Thank you.